it's not credible at all. I like Res Streeting's ideas. I think he's got a lot of good stuff to say on the NHS. And there is obviously a need to get waiting lists down, but he was referring back to people on Labour side have been referring back to how Labour got down waiting lists before. They did that with, various institutional and managerial reforms, yes, but also staggering amounts of money. The waiting list crisis in 99-2000 prompted Labour to completely unleash the taps. Over the period 97 to 2011, they increased NHS spending by 5.7% above inflation on average per year. That is a huge amount of money. And there is absolutely no sign that Labour is going to spend anything like that. In fact, Rachel Reeves is going around apparently telling people that we're not going to need to raise any further taxes at all. It's essentially impossible to reconcile those two pledges.
Let's start on Robert's Twitter mentions. And by that, I mean, every time, Robert, you ever tweet any point about policy, particularly if it's critical of the government, people say, oh, you should ask the guy who wrote the 2019 Tory manifesto, which, by the way, if listeners aren't aware, is you, right? You wrote the 2019 manifesto. You helped write the 2019 manifesto. And every day of the campaign period so far, we're seeing a drip, drip, drip of policies. The manifestos will be launched in a couple of weeks' time. Tell us what that process is like.
Yeah, so I was one of several people who wrote the Tory manifesto. I didn't have editorial control of it. In fact, I was brought in to do sort of editing as much as I was to just think great policy thoughts. But essentially, I mean, it varies according to the campaign. And I think, broadly speaking, there are two modes of doing a manifesto, and one is much more successful than another. One is where you get a group of clever people and you lock them away in a room, and then they come up with what their policies are. And that may or may not have anything to do with what the comms and messaging people in the campaign are doing. The other one is where you actually try to make the manifesto feel more part of the campaign. It's where you agree on what the messaging is for the campaign. You agree on who the target market is, and the idea is that the manifesto is a smooth and continuous part of whatever your overall strategy is.
And which was 2019?
So on the Tory side, 2019 was very much the latter. I mean, it was absolutely sort of all of a piece. Get Brexit done, and then do these other lovely things that the voters care about. But on the Labour side, I mean, they'll acknowledge as we talk to them. It was one of those classic campaigns where basically no one's really talking to each other and no one really likes each other by the end of it. So there was real tension between the guys doing the manifesto, between the policy guys, between the McDonnell guys, between the Corbyn guys. It was just, you can always tell when a campaign's in trouble when there are warring chieftains who are who are sort of pursuing slightly different agendas and effectively fighting slightly different campaigns. The Tories in 2017 would be a good example. The Tories in 2010 would be another example, where you had, Andy Coulson and Steve Hilton both effectively running sort of completely divergent messaging and strategies.
Yeah, and I can tell you from having reported quite extensively on that process, the 2019 Labour manifesto was a complete mess. So Morgan, we've spoken about the Tory process, 2019 manifesto. How important this time is the Labour manifesto, do you think? Because nothing currently seems to be moving the fundamentals of the polling picture. The party is sort of travelling quite light on big policy announcements. Is the manifesto likely to change that, do you think? Should it change that?
So Labour has yet to release its manifesto, obviously, and we will be expecting that in the coming days or weeks. I think we have a fairly clear idea of the kind of things that are going to be going into it, because Labour has so many sort of ancillary policy processes that come in. So there's the National Policy Forum, which is a sort of democratic body that met last summer that has already sort of put forward what it wants. There's also, things coming out of shadow cabinet teams. There's also, the missions famously. So I think we have a fairly clear idea of the realm of what can go into the manifesto. I would be surprised if it moved the dial significantly. I mean, I think Labour's polling extremely well, and I think it is unlikely to really boost itself with what comes out.
Are there any circumstances, Robert, in which you think the manifestos are likely to shift the dial? Because, and you may disagree, 2017, Theresa May goes into the election with a pretty massive poll lead, 23 points, similar to Keir Starmer's. The manifesto does not go terribly well. There's a policy in there that sort of wrong foots everyone, suggests people are going to have to sell their houses to pay for their granny's care, and that played a significant part of the unravelling of Theresa May's campaign and the unexpected hung parliament that followed. So is that the sort of thing we should be looking out for as the parties announce their manifesto?
Yeah, I think so. Generally speaking, manifestos are much more likely to hurt a party than to help a party if there's something in there that people take against. And this that sort of adds to the dynamic that we were just discussing. That if you're ahead, if you're comfortably ahead in the polls, you don't need to do anything. Like well, you don't need to do anything dramatic. Like in 2019, one of the key priorities was like not to have a manifesto that torpedoes the campaign in the way that 2017 did, and we achieved that. But then equally there were no sort of big sudden massive surprises in that manifesto which sort of came out of nowhere. If you're behind as the Tories are, you at the moment, you probably have to take bigger swings, which is what we're seeing this week with this rollout of pledges. I think the exception to the kind of rule that manifestos normally do more, not normally, but there's more downside risk than upside risk is 2017, when, if you remember, Labour's manifesto was leaked, and the fact that it was leaked kind of gave a sort of aura of spurious excitement to this, and everyone's going, "Oh, it's fully costed, and it's all promising all of these goodies." And wow, actually, maybe, and coupled with what was happening on the Tory side, people suddenly started to take a second look at Corbyn. I mean, that was intensely frustrating for me as a person who can count, because it was not fully costed at all. If you counted all the things they were promising to do and then looked at the costings document, there were just billions and billions and billions of pounds worth of stuff, which wasn't actually in the document, but no one seemed to pay attention. So. Yeah, they got a real bump in the polls from that.
And Morgan, I imagine your assessment of the Labour 2017 manifesto might differ a little bit from Robert's, but I think you both agree that that was a transformative moment in the campaign and showed that, if the stars align and it's released in the right sort of way, a manifesto can make an impact.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think those were popular and, as we've been talking about, coherent policies. And I think that's kind of the interesting point of contrast between Labour's 2017 and 2019 manifesto, because in 2017, popular, coherent policies. In 2019, the policies aren't particularly unpopular, but it's kind of an everything and the kitchen sink approach that's, and then whacking a massive spending commitment on WASPy in halfway through the campaign. And so, yeah.
Well, speaking of everything in the kitchen sink, that seems to be, as I was discussing with our colleague Gabriel Pogan from the Sunday Times a little bit earlier on this programme, the approach of the Conservative campaign. Let's look at the front page of this morning's Times, for instance. The Tories today promising that 1 in 8 university degree places would be scrapped if the Conservatives are re-elected, with the funding diverted into apprenticeships. Yesterday we had the triple lock plus the lifting of tax thresholds for state pensioners. Before that, over the weekend, we had national service. I mean, Robert, say what you like about the Conservative campaign, but they have a packed grid full of policy announcements, and they seem to know the voters they're targeting.
Yeah, and I think that there's a great example here of like Twitter is not the world. Like everyone on Twitter has been really upset about national service, really outraged about the quadruple lock, triple lock plus, whatever you want to call it. But we did a piece of work at the Centre for Policy Studies where we showed that as of this coming election now, in a majority of constituencies, once you wait for turnout, a majority of and digital distribution, a majority of voters are going to be over the age of 55. Like, so it's not just that the elderly are the Tories' core vote, although they absolutely are, and that is, that's who they, that's their kind of grey wall, as I and others have called it. That's their bastion. But like the electorate is quite elderly, and pledges which appeal to the elderly are generally quite popular. The triple lock, for all that people like me complain that it's utterly unaffordable, and that pensioners are the richest group in society and the richest group that has ever been in society, it's really, really popular. People have this kind of image of pensioners as needing more help. And likewise, national service is the classic example of a policy which is much, much more popular with old people than with young people, for kind of obvious reasons.
It's interesting. We were just talking about the approach Labour took in 2019, i.e. lots of policies that polled well individually, but people didn't particularly like the leader. Actually, people very much disliked the leader of the Labour Party at the time, Jeremy Corbyn, and they didn't think they were credible. Do you think there's a risk here, Robert, that the Tories end up in the same space, i.e. all of the things they're announcing are going to appeal to a certain demographic of voters, but they might not believe the messaging.
Yeah, especially when money is quite tight. I think I'd be surprised if there was a lot more with many £billion price tags coming up. I mean, the classic example in 2019 was if you talk to pollsters and people who are doing focus groups, was free broadband. This was a policy which was on its own very popular. Who doesn't want free stuff? But when people heard that, they were like, "Well, hang on a second. Sorry, how are we going to pay for that? Like, I pay for my broadband. I'm happy to pay for my broadband." Like, it suddenly went. It was that there was a straw that broke the camel's back on that, and it made people think, "Oh, hang on a second. No, they are just promising a load of free stuff that they can't actually afford."
Well, Labour are out this morning talking about when, once the questions about Dan Abbott stop, they're talking about NHS waiting times. Here's Wes Streeting on Times Radio Breakfast this morning.
At this election, we are the only party with a plan on the NHS. Rishi Sunak is running from the NHS. He doesn't want to talk about the NHS. He has a catastrophic record on the NHS. Remember, he said he wanted to be judged by his 5 key pledges, and he said he would cut waiting lists. He has spectacularly failed. He is a walking failure. And if he gets the keys to number 10 again, it will be people across the country waiting in pain and agony that are paying the price.
Well, that's Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, in a state of high dudgeon, I think we can say. What do you make of this, Morgan? Because it's a pretty big pledge from the Labour Party. Clear the NHS waiting list backlog in England within 5 years. How do you think this is going to go down?
I mean, it's certainly a very ambitious pledge, probably one of the party's most ambitious. I mean, so I've been out campaigning for Labour over the last week, and I was in the Medway towns over the last couple of days, and it's an issue that just comes up again and again on the doorstep. People saying, I've been waiting 2 years for an NHS appointment. So it's definitely answering a real demand. I think it's kind of striking to me that this is such a sort of present issue in how people experience the public realm, basically, and the Tories seem to offer not much more than more of the same on specifically the waiting list issue. So I mean, Labour's being ambitious, but it's right to be ambitious on this, I think.
It's ambitious, Robert, but do you think it's credible? When you listen to Wes Streeting, obviously he's a very fluent performer. He enjoys and is very good at riling the left of his party. But in terms of the substance, Robert, do you hear much there that convinces you? I.e., Wes Streeting often says NHS is service, not a shrine. You can't just chuck money at it. But what is it? What is he actually planning? And do plans like this require also a lot of money that Labour currently isn't necessarily being clear with regards to tax and other policies, how it would spend?
Yeah, the answer is it's not credible at all. I like Wes Streeting's ideas. I think he's got a lot of good stuff to say on the NHS, and there was obviously a need to get waiting lists down, but he was referring back to people on the Labour side have been referring back to how Labour got down waiting lists before. They did that with, various institutional and managerial reforms, yes, but also staggering amounts of money. The waiting list crisis in 1999-2000 prompted Labour to completely unleash the taps. Over the period 97 to 2011, they increased NHS spending by 5.7% above inflation on average per year. That is a huge amount of money. And there is absolutely no sign that Labour is going to spend anything like that. In fact, Rachel Reeves is going around apparently telling people that we're not going to need to raise any further taxes at all. It's essentially impossible to reconcile those two pledges.
Do you think that line can hold over the course of a campaign, Morgan? Well, obviously, it may well hold over the course of a campaign. But both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer saying, look, we've announced all the tax rises we'll talk about over the course of a campaign. When you hear Labour politicians say that, do you think, well, necessary evil, no one goes into an election promising to raise taxes? Or do you think it's sort of sowing the seeds of problems for Labour if, in 6 months' time, it gets in the event they get in, and say, God, there is no money, to quote Liam Byrne or misquote Liam Byrne, we need to raise taxes?
I mean, so Labour's saying it's going to pay for its NHS pledges through closing the non-dom tax loophole and cracking down on tax dodgers. There would seem to be a sort of question over public service funding if Labour comes into power. There is, I think you're right in saying it will be a big question in sort of 6 months' time, a year's time, when things are difficult.
Things are difficult, and Wes Streeting is finding that he does need money to clear the backlog, and reform or answers about reform in an interview don't quite do the heavy lifting. It's interesting though, Robert. Morgan and I were talking there about the question of parties saying, well, we'll crack down on tax avoidance and that'll raise us 5-6 billion. People have knocked the Labour Party for that repeatedly over the past year or so, because that's their answer to quite a lot of questions. But if you look at some of the things the Tories have announced, the triple lot plus, they're saying the same thing. They're saying, the 6 billion this will raise will come from us cracking down on tax avoidance and evasion. Do you think on both parties' parts that's a bit of a cop-out answer? Let's crack down on tax avoidance. It's a sort of way of, plucking money out of thin air, surely, without necessarily having to do the politically difficult thing of levying a new specific tax, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there was 6 billion quid lying on the floor in tax evasion and avoidance, then you have to assume that at some point, the government would have picked it up. But I do slightly admire the chutzpah on the Tory side. That Labour are saying they're going to fund things, but the non-dom pledge is not going to raise anything like the amount of money they say it is, because all the non-doms are leaving. It's a disastrous policy. Just absolute self-inflicted wound. But
Jeremy Hunt just lifted it off.
Yeah, but Jeremy Hunt just stole it. So they've said, rather than saying to Labour, hey, your assumptions about tax evasion and avoidance are nonsense, they've said, okay, fine, if you're saying you can get 6 billion from this, we're saying we can get 6 billion from exactly the same thing.
Well, we'll continue this fevered discussion in just a moment. We're going to be talking about the pressing issue that's worrying a lot of election candidates. It's a cross-party consensus. Is my child, not my child, I don't have one, not that I know of, is my child going to end up in the parliamentary creche? It's the question nobody knows the answers to.